Right. Today we'll be reading the second half of Chapter 7, A Day with the Beavers. So the children all got close together and walked up to the tree, and in behind it, and there, sure enough, they found the beaver. But it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, "Further in, come further in, right in here. We're not safe in the open." Only when it had led them into a dark spot where 4 trees grew so close together that their boughs met and the brown earth and pine needles could be seen underfoot, because no snow had been able to fall there, did it begin to talk to them. "Are you the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve?" it said. "We're some of them," said Peter. "Shh," said the beaver. "Not so loud, please. We're not safe, even here." "Why? Who are we afraid of?" asked Peter. "There's no one here but ourselves." "There are the trees," said the beaver. "They're always listening. Most of them are on our side, but there are trees that would betray us to her. You know who I mean." And it nodded its head several times. "If it comes to talking about sides," said Edmund, "how do we know you're a friend?" "Not meaning to be rude, Mr. Beaver," added Peter, "but you see, we're strangers." Quite right," said the beaver. "Here is my token." With these words it held up a little white object. They all looked at it in surprise, till Lucy suddenly said, "Oh, of course, it's my handkerchief, the one I gave to poor Mr. Tumnus." "That's right," said the beaver. "Poor fellow, he got wind of the arrest before it actually happened, and handed this over to me. He said that if anything happened to him, I must meet you here, and take you on to—" Here Mr. Beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave 1 or 2 very mysterious nods. Then signaling to the children to stand as close around it as possible, so that their faces were actually tickling by its whiskers, it added in a low whisper, "They say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps he already landed." And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do, but the moment the beaver had spoken those words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it has something to do with you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream it feels as if you had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes you dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get back into that dream. It was like that now. As the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump inside them. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter felt suddenly brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strand of music was floating by her. And Lucy got the feeling you would have when you wake up in the morning and realize that it's the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. "And what about Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "Where is he?" "Shh," said the beaver. "Not here. I must bring you to where we can really talk, and also dinner." No one except Edmund felt any difficulty about trusting the beaver now, and everyone, including Edmund, was very glad to hear the word dinner. They therefore all hurried along behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest part of the forests, for over an hour. Everyone was feeling very tired and very hungry when suddenly the trees began to grow thinner in front of them, and the ground to fall steeply downhill. A minute later they came out under the open sky. The sun was still shining, and found themselves looking on a fine sight. They were standing at the edge of a steep, narrow valley at the bottom of which ran, at least it would have been running if it hadn't been frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them a dam that was built across this river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that, of course, beavers are always making dams, and quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed that he now had a sort of modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when you are visiting a garden they've made or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say, "Hush," this time, but merely a trifle, and it isn't really finished." Above the dam there was what ought to have been a deep pool, but was now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice. And below the dam, much lower down, was more ice. But instead of being smooth, this was all frozen into foamy and wavy shapes, in which the water had been rushing along at the very moment when the frost came. And where the water had been trickling over and spurting through the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered all over with flowers and wreaths and festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive. And from a hole in the roof, smoke was going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were before. That is what the others chiefly noticed. But Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river there was another small river, which came down another small valley to join it. And looking up that valley, Edmund could see two small hills, and he was almost sure those were the two hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted her at the lamp-post the other day. And then, between them, he thought, must be her palace, only a mile off or less. And he thought about the Turkish delight, and about being a king. And I wonder how Peter will like that, he asked himself, and horrible ideas came into his head. "Here we are," said Mr. Beaver, and it looked as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. "I'll lead the way, but be careful, don't slip." The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not for humans, a very nice place to walk because it was covered with ice. And though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop to a lower river on the other. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in single file right out to the middle, where they could look a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they had reached the middle, they were at the door of the house. "Here we are, Mrs. Beaver," said Mr. Beaver. "I've found them. Here are the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve." And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed, as it was in a burring sound, and the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine. And it was from it that came the sound. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. "So you've come at last," she said, holding out both her wrinkled old paws. "At last! To think that I ever should have lived to see this day. The potatoes are on boiling, and the kettle's singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish?" "That I will," said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice to a deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice, which he kept open every day with his hatchet. They took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly. Looked hard into it, then suddenly shot in his paw and before you could say Jack Robinson had whisked out a beautiful trout. Then he did it all over again, until they had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table, and cut the bread, and put the plates in the oven to heat, and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in the corner of the house, and to put on the frying pan, and to get the dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds, there were bunks, like on board ships, built into the wall. And there were hams and strings of onions hanging from the roof. And against the walls were gumboots and oil slicks, and hatchets, and pairs of shears, and spades, and trowels, and things carrying mortar in, and fishing rods, and fishing nets, and sacks. And the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, which Mr. Beaver had already opened with his knife, and cleaned in the open air. You can think how good the new-caught fish smelled while they were frying, and how the hungry children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungrier still they became before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes, and then put them all in back of the pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout. So that in the very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools. It was all three-legged stools in the Beavers' house, except for Mrs. Beaver's special own rocking chair beside the fire, and preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children, and a great big lump of yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as they wanted to go with their potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago, and has just come out of the pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and glorious sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire, so that when they had finished their marmalade rolls, the tea was made and ready to be poured. And when each person had got his, or her, cup of tea, each person shoved back his, or her stool, so as to be able to lean against the wall, and gave a huge sigh of contentment. "And now," said Mr. Beaver, pushing away his empty mug and pulling his cup of tea toward him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit and nicely going, why, now we can get to business. It's snowing again," he added, cocking an eye at the window. "That's all the better, because it means we shouldn't have any visitors, and if anyone should have been trying to follow you, why, he couldn't find the tracks." And that is the end of chapter 7. So think back to the details that the author has included. How are the two settings, Mr. Tumnus's house and the Beaver's house, different? And how are they the same? Then I was also thinking that I don't think the author introduced Mr. Beaver and his family as just a random encounter that doesn't play a larger role in the overall structure of the text. So as we continue listening, let's be thinking about how Mr. Beaver's role is critical to the development of the problem or the solution of this story.